Arizona Territory, spring of 1881. The land didn't whisper, it groaned. Wind rolled in low from the north, like it was dragging something dead behind it. The sun hung low and mean, pressing heat into every crack of earth, baking the rocks until they bled rust. Even the cacti looked tired, slumped, brittle, begging for rain that hadn't come in months. And riding through it, a man, alone. Caleb Mercer didn't speak to the wind, and the wind didn't bother trying with him. He rode slow, reins loose in one hand, the other resting on the saddle horn. His horse, a pale sorrel with scars down its flank, moved like it had nowhere important to be. Same as the man on its back. Caleb's coat was a faded gray, old Confederate issue, worn down to threads at the elbows. The limp in his right leg wasn't fresh, but every step the horse took seemed to remind him anyway. His hat was pulled low, casting shadow over a face carved out of bone and bad memories. Blue eyes, cold as dry river stone. Tucked inside his shirt pocket against his chest was a wooden cross. Blackened at the edges, the kind of burn that doesn't happen by accident. He never touched it, but he never left it behind either. 3 years ago, he'd watched his wife and little girl burn. Some said stove accident, others said God's will. Caleb never answered. He just stopped talking altogether. Now he kept to his land. 50 acres of brush and dust nobody wanted. A single-room cabin, a leaning barn, a fence he fixed every spring and cursed every summer. Today he was chasing cattle again, 3 damn steers that broke loose after a night of thunder and bad wire. That's all it was supposed to be, another ride through deadland, another day not thinking about what he'd lost. But the ravine ahead didn't look right, and the buzz of flies didn't sound like livestock. Not this time. The flies got there first. Caleb reined in at the edge of the ravine, eyes narrowing. What should have been a patch of brush and busted stone now held something different, wrong. The ground below was scattered with signs, broken branches, trampled dirt, a canteen torn open like it'd been chewed through. Blood, dried black, flaked along the rocks. A strip of military blue caught on a thorn bush fluttered in the wind. He slid off the horse, boots crunching gravel. That's when he saw her. She was half buried beneath dust and thorn, curled, not like someone sleeping, but like something dropped. A woman, young, Apache. Her skin blistered and raw. One arm lay twisted under her, the other stretched out as if reaching toward something she'd never grasp. And then, her legs, or what was left of them, both had been cut above the knee, not clean, but deliberate, wrapped in soaked rawhide and pine sap. Whoever did it knew she'd die anyway, and left her to prove the point. Caleb didn't speak, didn't curse, just stared. Her chest rose, barely, breath like a ghost's. Her lips were split, her dress torn across the front, exposing skin too long under sun. But her eyes were open and locked on his. No fear, no plea, just a quiet defiance, like she'd seen death and wasn't impressed. A falcon cried out overhead, circling once before fading into the haze. Caleb exhaled slow, pulled off his hat, and stepped closer. His boots stopped inches from her hand. She didn't flinch. He crouched, hand hovering a moment over the burnt cloth at her side, then slid both arms beneath her, one under her shoulders, one where her legs should have been. Blood soaked into his shirt as he lifted. Her body jerked once, a strangled sound caught in her throat. Still, she said nothing. Caleb stood there a long moment, holding her. The wind shifted. Dust lifted from the rocks like smoke from a grave. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb didn't ride away from something. He turned toward home. Caleb kept one arm braced around her shoulders, the other guiding the reins. His horse, Brim, moved like it understood the weight it carried was no longer just flesh, but something sacred and breaking. The woman's head lolled against his chest. He could feel heat rising off her skin, fever setting in fast. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had started to dip low, dragging shadows long across the scrubland. The old wooden structure stood like a tired sentinel, its roof patched with tin, porch crooked, windows dusty with months of wind. Caleb didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open with his boot, carried her inside, and laid her gently on his cot. A narrow bed with a wool blanket and a pillow stuffed with dry grass and memories. He stood over her a moment, jaw tight, hands stained dark. Then he moved. Water from the barrel, cloth boiled over the fire, a knife cleaned with whiskey. He worked without words, cut linen into strips, ground dry sage into a poultice, dabbed pine pitch into her wounds to slow the rot. His fingers were thick, clumsy, but his movements were precise, focused. He didn't ask her name. He didn't give her his. He didn't need to. At some point, he peeled off his old cavalry coat, worn soft with age, and laid it over her. The buttons glinted dull in the lamplight. She didn't stir. Across the room, on a shelf near the stove, sat the burned cross. He took it down, held it for a long moment. Then, without ceremony, he placed it gently on the nightstand beside her. Not to preach, not to save, just so she wouldn't be alone in the dark. The fire cracked once in the hearth. Sparks fluttered and died. Caleb pulled the chair from the corner, sat near the edge of the bed, elbows on knees, eyes fixed on the slow rise and fall of her chest. He didn't sleep, not that night. Near dawn, just as the sky started to soften at the edges, she stirred. Her lips parted, barely moving. "You stayed?" she whispered. Just 2 words, but they landed like thunder. Caleb didn't speak. He just nodded once, slow and steady. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of silence shift. Can you guess what's about to happen? Leave your prediction in the comments. The first few days were all creaks and footsteps, the kind of quiet that didn't come from peace, but from things left unsaid. Caleb kept to the front of the cabin, patching fence wire, feeding the horse, keeping the fire going. Nalia stayed to the cot, wrapped in his old cavalry coat, her breath still shallow, her eyes open more often than closed. They didn't exchange names, didn't ask questions, didn't try. Every sound echoed, the scrape of a bowl, the rattle of a kettle lid. Her fingers sometimes tapped on the wooden headboard, not in rhythm, just in thought. He noticed she never turned her back to the door. Even when asleep, her head tilted just enough to see the threshold. The space between them was only 15 feet, but it may as well have been miles. Caleb left bread and dried meat on the table. Nothing fancy, just enough. She never ate while he was in the room, but by the time he came back from the well or pasture, the food was gone. She began folding the blanket each morning. He'd unfold it again by sundown. Once, she caught him watching her try to shift positions, her body dragging slightly across the mattress, teeth clenched against the pain. He didn't say anything, just grabbed an old boot box, stuffed it with rags, and slid it under her knees. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. At night, the fire was always low. Enough for warmth, not enough for comfort. There were no prayers, no stories, no promises. But there were moments, like when she brushed her fingers along the windowsill, tracing the faint names etched into the wood. Mara, Ellie, names he hadn't spoken since the fire. Or the time she pulled one of his shirts from the laundry line, tried to fold it, got stuck halfway, and left it on the chair without a word. The fold was wrong. He wore it anyway. Once she stared at the cross above the hearth for so long he almost took it down. Instead, he left it, and she let it be. Some nights they sat on opposite ends of the cabin, fire crackling soft between them. Nothing passed between their lips, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like waiting, like two people caught in the middle of something ancient and unfinished. The silence wasn't cold anymore. It had changed. Not warm. Not yet, but patient. On the fourth day, Caleb wheeled the broken axle of an old cart into the cabin. Dust puffed from the floorboards as he dropped it near the hearth. Nalia watched from the cot, her eyes flicking from the splintered wood to his hands. Rough, steady, scarred like riverbed stone. He didn't speak, just started sanding. By dusk, he'd turned the axle into a crude rolling board. Flat cedar plank, 4 rusted wheels, worn leather straps nailed down at the corners, and a scrap of hide cushioned at the center. When he pushed it gently toward her side of the cot, she didn't reach for it, didn't move. But the next morning, he found the cot empty. She was halfway across the cabin, hands braced on the plank, sweat dotting her temples. Her breath hitched with every inch. She was dragging herself toward the table. He didn't offer help, just pulled out the chair. She didn't thank him, just sat. That afternoon, she attempted to cook. Poured too much water in the beans, oversalted the bread, and nearly set the bacon on fire. When she tried to lift the skillet off the heat, she lost her grip and cursed low in Apache. Caleb stepped in, silently, grabbed the skillet, and served up the mess as if it were supper in a fine saloon. He ate every bite. Later, she sat near the fire, poking at the coals with a stick. "Quiet man," she muttered under her breath. Not a name, not a jab, just observation. Caleb didn't correct her. From then on, she used it when she needed him. "Quiet man, the pan's too heavy." "Quiet man, pass the oilskin." Once, after he walked in soaked from rain, she just said, "Quiet man, sit before you drown inside out." He never told her his real name, and she didn't ask. Some nights he found his saddle blanket folded on the porch rail, rain brushed off. Other times she left a tin cup of boiled sage near his seat by the fire, good for headaches and haunting memories. And then there was the carving. One evening he noticed the rolling board had new marks. Symbols, tiny, faint, etched into the wood. Waves, a bird, a crescent moon. Apache symbols. Stories, maybe, or prayers. He didn't ask. Instead, he ran his fingers across them once, slow, and then left a piece of coal chalk next to her cot. Next morning, there were 3 more marks. She didn't explain. He didn't need her to. That was the thing about kindness out here. Nobody had to name it for it to be real. It just was. The nightmares started on the 6th night. It was well past midnight when Nalia thrashed against the cot, arms flailing, a cry tearing loose in her native tongue, sharp, fast, ancient. The rolling board clattered to the floor, her breathing ragged, as if caught in some old fire no one could see. Caleb was up before his boots hit the floor. He knelt beside her, hands held out, not grabbing, just offering presence. Her eyes snapped open, wild and wet. For a moment she didn't see him, only shadows. Then, breath by breath, the war drained from her face. She blinked slowly. He stayed where he was, silent as always. "You're safe now," he said. Only the second time he'd spoken since finding her. She stared at him for a long while, lips trembling slightly, then turned away and tucked the cavalry coat back up to her chin. She didn't cry, just stared at the wall like it owed her something. The next morning, he noticed the necklace. It had been there the whole time, half hidden beneath her collarbone, Small, smooth bone pieces strung on rawhide, carved with lines too fine for casual eyes. Apache, he figured. Protective, maybe. A ward against spirits. He didn't touch it, just nodded once. That afternoon, while mending a loose board on the porch, he reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out the blackened wooden cross. The edges were still scorched, one side cracked down the middle. He sat it beside her drinking cup that evening. She noticed, didn't touch it, but she didn't move it either. Two symbols, bone and ash, left side by side. Two stories, two kinds of pain. Caleb didn't sleep that night. He sat out back under the stars, eyes tracing constellations he didn't name. Nalia wheeled herself to the doorway, wrapped in his coat, and sat in the frame like a silhouette carved from dusk. She didn't say anything about the nightmare. He didn't ask. They just sat there. Later, when the fire burned low and the wind carried coyotes across the hills, she reached up and touched the necklace, then glanced at the cross through the open door. "Some things," she whispered, "don't stay burned." Caleb didn't answer, but when he turned in for the night, he found her cot pushed closer to the hearth. Just by a few inches, but enough. Enough to know the ghosts were still there. But neither of them had to face them alone anymore. The storm rolled in from the east just after supper. Not the kind that broke with thunder, but the slow-building sort, quiet, electric, ancient. Caleb stood on the porch, watching as clouds boiled over the desert like smoke from an angry god. Nalia wheeled herself beside him, blanket over her lap, coat wrapped tight around her shoulders. They said nothing for a long time. The wind tugged at her hair. His jaw clenched against the weight of silence. He had always watched storms, counted seconds between flash and boom. But that night he watched the way Nalia's fingers moved, tracing shapes in the air like prayers. Finally she spoke, soft, low, like the desert whispering through stone. "When the storm comes, we say Sky Woman is walking." Caleb looked sideways, one brow raised. "She walks above the clouds," she continued, "with her deer-hide skirt and lightning in her palms. When she's angry, she sends thunderbirds to shake the earth. But sometimes," Nalia paused, eyes on the sky, "sometimes she just walks, to see if we still listen." He didn't laugh, he didn't scoff, just nodded once, slow. "Used to be," he said after a beat. "I thought storms were punishment. Fire, ash, flood, hell from above." She glanced at him, curious. "My wife and daughter," he hesitated. "They died in a fire. One spark. Whole place gone in a blink." Nalia didn't reach for him, didn't say sorry, just let the wind carry his words into the coming dark. He cleared his throat, voice cracked like old timber. "There's a verse I remember. Ain't been to church in years, but it stuck." He looked up at the sky, as if the words lived there. "Blessed are the broken, for they shall be held." The storm began to break overhead. Lightning cracked distant mountains in two. Rain came in slow waves, spitting, soft, like Sky Woman was walking gently tonight. They stayed under the porch awning, shoulder to shoulder, as the sky wept around them. And for a moment, faith wasn't about sermons or saints. It wasn't about being right. It was about stillness, about one soul recognizing another in the middle of a storm. Later, as the wind died down, Nalia plucked a feather from the porch rail. "A gift from the thunderbird," she said, and tucked it behind his ear with the gentleness of a mother tucking in a child. Caleb didn't flinch, didn't speak, but he didn't take it out either. The first sign wasn't a gunshot or a rider. It was silence, too perfect, too deliberate. The kind of silence that sucked the wind from the canyon and made the birds forget their song. Caleb was chopping firewood behind the cabin when he heard the soft clop of hooves, slow, deliberate. He straightened, axe in hand, eyes narrowing as a mule crested the rise. Its rider was tall, thin, and wore a greasy duster that had seen better days. His hat was low, but his eyes were sharp, cunning sharp, snake sharp. "Afternoon," the man called. Caleb didn't answer. The rider eased closer, smile stretched thin and oily. "You Mercer?" Caleb nodded once. "Who's askin'?" "Name's Elias Creed, scoutin' for Marshal Corbin out of Dry Hollow. Lookin' for someone." Caleb said nothing, just wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. Creed's smile tightened. "Heard tell a wagon got raided couple weeks back. Apache skirmish. Few survivors. One girl, legs blown clear off, but lived." He leaned forward like telling a secret. "Word is, she's still breathin'."
"Word is, someone's hiding her." Inside the cabin, Nalia sat still on her board, barely breathing, the bone necklace clutched in her fist. "I got no one here but a mule, a stove, and ghosts," Caleb said flatly. Creed's eyes flicked to the cabin, lingered a second too long, then turned back to Caleb. "Mighty convenient place for ghosts, then." He dismounted, slow, careful, the way a man does when he wants to prove he ain't a threat, but might become one if given cause. "Mind if I take a look around?" Caleb stepped forward, axe still in hand. His voice dropped like gravel in a grave. "I mind." Creed paused, then chuckled. "Easy there, Reb. No need for dramatics. Just doing my job." "You already done too much." Creed held his hands up. "All right, then. I'll be back with paper. Marshal want a proper search." He mounted up again, tipping his hat mockingly. "Word to the wise, Mercer. Ain't nobody worth hanging for." Caleb didn't blink. "Then I reckon you'd better pray I ain't nobody." Creed rode off slow, dust curling behind him like a rattlesnake trail. When he was gone, Caleb stepped inside. Nalia was still as stone. "He'll come back," she said quietly.
"I know." She stared at him. "What if you don't outrun him next time?" Caleb knelt beside her. His hands, calloused and steady, reached for the board. "Then we don't run." The morning after Creed left, Caleb disappeared at first light. Didn't say where he was going, just saddled up Brim, packed a satchel, and rode west. He was gone all day. Nalia waited in silence, her eyes fixed on the tree line. She didn't eat, didn't pray. Just sat with the feather behind her ear and the bone charm clutched tight in her hand. By sundown he returned, smelling of sweat, gunpowder, and old railroad iron. Behind Brim he dragged a wagon load of lumber scraps, metal braces, and rusted hinges, salvage from the abandoned mining camp down in Challa Gulch. Without a word, he unloaded the mess behind the cabin and started digging. That night, Nalia rolled to the back door and watched from the threshold as Caleb worked. Shirt soaked, knuckles raw, a hammer beating out the rhythm of a promise he couldn't say aloud. He was building a cellar, not a hiding place, a fortress. Beams of old railroad laid crosswise, walls lined with clay and rock. A vent disguised as a barrel, a latch beneath the rug. It wasn't meant for escape. It was meant for standing their ground. Inside, Nalia stitched. Her hands weren't fast, but they were sure. From torn hide and spare cloth, she crafted a sash. Simple, narrow, rough at the edges. On it, she embroidered one word, jagged and black like mountain script. Still. Still breathing. Still here. Still hers. She laid it across the cot that night. Caleb found it when he came in, shoulders sagging from a day of digging. He ran a hand across the thread, then looked at her. No words passed. None were needed. Later, she said his name. Caleb. Just that. He froze, like hearing it dragged something sacred up from the earth. Then he walked to her side.
She reached up, slow, unsure, and touched his face. His skin was rough, weathered by sun and war and time. But it was real, warm. He didn't lean in, didn't kiss her, just slid his arms under her frame and carried her, gently, reverently, to the cot. He lay beside her, one arm beneath her neck, the other across her waist. They didn't speak, didn't move, didn't sleep for a while either. But for the first time, they didn't face the dark alone. And in the soft hush between breaths, with rain tapping on the roof, Nalia whispered, "You ain't just quiet, Caleb, you're true." And that, more than any vow, any ring, any sermon, was enough. The hawk came first. It circled once, twice, 3 times, too slow, too low, wings slicing through silence like a blade through linen. Nalia watched from the doorway, eyes narrowed, the feather in her hair trembling against the wind. "They're close," she said. Caleb stood by the fence, hands calloused around a post he wasn't fixing. His eyes followed the bird, jaw locked, boots unmoving. "How close?" he asked. She didn't answer with words, just pointed to the dust rising on the horizon, thin but steady. A line. Riders. Caleb stepped into the cabin, pulled open the trapdoor to the cellar, and checked the lantern. 1 match, 2 tins of beans, his rifle and 6 extra shells. It would have to be enough. Outside, Nalia wheeled herself toward the edge of the porch. Wind whipped her braids into her face, and she didn't bother brushing them back. "They'll have dogs," she murmured. "They'll smell me, even underground." Caleb walked past her and began boarding up the windows. Quick, clean. Like he'd done it before. Like the war never really left his bones. "I'm not hiding," she said. He paused at the second shutter, turned. "I know." She glanced down at her lap, then back at him. "You sure about this?" Caleb nodded once. "Ain't a thing in this world I've been more sure of." There was no romance in his tone, just steel, dirt, dust, truth. Nalia reached into the pouch by her side and pulled out something small, wrapped in worn cloth. She unrolled it slowly and held it out to him. A ring, carved from bone, smoothed by fire. The etching barely legible. A sun, a river, a broken line mended with a stitch. "I made it with my last blade," she said, "back when I still had hands that didn't shake. Ain't much, but it's yours." Caleb took it, didn't speak, didn't cry, just slipped it onto his finger and closed his fist like a prayer. Later that evening, they sat by the fire, the cellar door open behind them like a final breath. Neither moved, neither blinked. The sun bled out over the canyon, and far off, just beyond the reach of the wind, came the distant sound of hooves. Nalia leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "Then we make 'em regret it." The knock came sharp and fast, like the butt of a rifle, not the back of a hand. Caleb set down his coffee slowly. He didn't need to look out the window to know they'd come. 2 men sat their horses at the gate. Both wore regulation coats, dusty and sun-bleached, but the brass badges at their collars glinted with purpose. One carried a folded parchment in his breast pocket. The other had his hand too close to his holster. "Caleb Mercer?" the first called. Caleb stepped onto the porch, rifle propped in plain view against the doorframe. "You already know the answer," he said, voice low as distant thunder. The man on the left pulled the paper, unfolded it slow. "We're with the federal marshal out of Copper Ridge. You're harboring a fugitive, Apache woman, maimed, dangerous." Caleb didn't flinch. "Ain't seen a soul but my own shadow." The other rider snorted. "Funny, We tracked a wagon wheel dragging through brush less than a mile from here. And a hawk don't circle a dead sky unless there's blood underneath it." Inside, Nalia stayed hidden, curled beneath the cellar's hatch, eyes locked on the slivers of daylight between floorboards. She could hear their boots on dry wood, hear the metal in their voices. "Look, mister," said the first man, softening just enough to sound human. "We ain't here to make trouble, but you're playing a dangerous game. There's law now. She's wanted for what happened outside Gunnison, burnt wagons, dead traitors. You hide her, you swing beside her." "She ain't here," Caleb said again. But even as he spoke, the second soldier dismounted. Boots crunched over gravel as he scanned the ground near the barn. A minute passed, then another. "Hey," the man called, "you see this?" The first turned, followed the gesture. A faint line in the dirt, curved, repeated, like a wheel, like a track that didn't belong to any wagon. The first soldier's gaze returned to Caleb, eyes narrower now. "We'll be back, with men, with paper." Caleb didn't move, didn't blink. "Bring God himself," he said flatly. "Won't change a thing." The soldiers turned, dirt kicked up in the wind. As their silhouettes disappeared over the rise, Caleb stepped back inside, closed the door, locked it. In the stillness, Nalia emerged from the trapdoor, face unreadable. "They'll be back," she said. He nodded once, "and we won't be running." That night, the stars hung heavy over Copper Ridge, silent witnesses to the storm brewing beneath. Caleb didn't sleep. He sat at the table, lantern low, rifle across his lap. His hands didn't tremble, but they stayed clenched longer than usual. Outside, the coyotes howled. Even they knew something was shifting. Nalia rolled up beside him, blanket around her shoulders. "You ain't gotta stay," she said, voice soft. No accusation in it, just truth. He didn't look at her, just stared into the lantern flame like it could burn a different future. He exhaled, slow. Thought about saying more, but she knew better. Words were fragile things, and tonight needed steel. So instead, she handed him a folded scrap of hide, rough and faded. "What's this?" he asked. "My brother's prayer cloth. He carried it before the bluecoats took him. Said it kept his heart steady." Caleb unfolded it. Inside was a worn Apache symbol for protection, 2 arrows crossing in a ring of sun. "I don't pray much," he said. "You don't need to," she replied. "Just don't give up." He tucked it into his shirt pocket beside the burned wooden cross. Later, while Nalia slept, Caleb wrote a letter, short, blunt. "To whoever finds this, I chose her, not for pity, not for guilt, because she's worth it." He folded it, slid it under the cot, and pressed his thumbprint in ash over the seal. At first light, he walked the perimeter, hammered shut loose planks on the barn, buried the water barrels, loaded the last of the shells. Every step was deliberate, like each nail driven wasn't to keep something out, but to hold something sacred in. Nalia found him at the fence line, staring at the horizon. "You ready?" she asked. Caleb didn't turn. "They bring fire, I'll meet it. They bring blood, I'll bleed first." "You really think we can win?" "No." Pause. "But I'll still fight." She nodded, and with that the wind shifted. Not a storm, but something heavier. Destiny, maybe. The wind picked up just after sundown, dry, sharp, and restless. It dragged dust across the porch, rattled the hinges on the barn door, and whispered warnings through every crack in the cabin walls. Inside, Nalia sat beside the hearth, the glow of the coals casting flickers across her face. In her lap, wrapped in deer hide and memories, was the only thing she'd saved from her brother, his old hunting knife. It wasn't much anymore. Handle cracked, edge dulled, balance thrown off by time and fire. But it had weight and history. She didn't speak when she wheeled herself across the floor. She simply held the knife out, handle first. Caleb looked up from the ammo box, took the blade slowly, the way a man takes communion, like it mattered more than breath. "I ain't asking you to save me again," she said, eyes steady. "I got no use for heroes." He looked at her, really looked, into the parts of her that were bone and grit and something older than war. "I ain't a hero," he said. "Good," she replied. "Then fight beside me, or not at all." Caleb didn't nod, didn't promise. He just placed the knife next to his rifle on the table, beside the bone charm, the burned cross, and the worn cloth she gave him. It was his altar now.
Later that night, as the fire died down, Nalia took her rolling board outside. On the underside, using a piece of coal, she carved one word beside Caleb's initials: bound. Not by blood, not by law, but by choice. By the things they'd survived together and the things they were willing to face next. When she came back in, she found Caleb asleep in the chair, the knife still in his hand, fingers curled around it like a vow he couldn't say. She didn't wake him, just watched the slow rise and fall of his chest and whispered, "Let it be enough." And in that silence, a bond was sealed, not in words, not in wedding bands, but in blade, fire, and ash. Dawn rose pale and bruised, the kind of morning that smelled like smoke before a single flame was seen. Caleb was already outside when Nellie awoke, his silhouette etched against the dim orange sky, hammering the last support beam under the porch. The wood was scavenged from an old railway fence, splintered and stubborn but strong. Inside, the cabin had changed too. The rifle now leaned beside the front door, loaded. The cellar trap had been reinforced with iron hooks and double hinges. 2 canteens sat by the cot, full. Everything had its place. Everything had its purpose. Nalia wheeled to the table and pulled out her carving kit. Just 3 slivers of bone, a dull blade, and her steadying breath. She hadn't carved in months, not since before they cut her down. But today her hands didn't shake. She made 2 beads. One read, "Now," the other, "Home." When she gave them to Caleb, she didn't explain. He didn't ask. He threaded them onto the leather cord that already held her bone charm and his burned cross. Tied it around his neck like armor. By midday, the barn was cleared of flammable goods. Caleb had doused the walls with water. The animals, what few remained, were released to the hills. There was no speech, no prayer, only the creak of old floorboards and the scent of burned coffee. At one point, Nalia found Caleb standing by the back door, holding his father's pocket watch. It hadn't ticked in years, but he kept winding it anyway, like time might be something you could bend, or buy, or break. She rolled beside him and slipped her hand into his. Not to steady him, just to say, "I'm here." He looked down, nodded, and whispered, "I know." That night they ate cornbread and beans by candlelight. Neither said much, but something in the way he passed her the salt and how she refilled his cup said more than vows ever could. They weren't bracing for a storm. They were meeting it, together. The sky turned iron gray by late afternoon. Wind carried the copper tang of something coming. Caleb knew that smell. It wasn't just dust or heat. It was intent. At sundown, they came. Elias Creed led the way, riding a red mare like War himself. 2 other men followed, both armed, both eager. No badges this time, just guns and grins. "Didn't figure you'd make this hard, Mercer," Creed called from the gate, voice syrupy and sharp. "She ain't worth dying for." Caleb stepped out slow, rifle in hand. "Ain't about worth, it's about what's right." Creed smirked.
That's rich, from a man with a rebel cross and blood on his boots. Then he tossed something into the air, a lit bottle of oil. It hit the barn, shattering in flame. Fire roared fast, climbing the old timber like it had waited years to burn. From behind the cellar door, Nalia heard it, crackling, eating, hungering. She didn't panic. She grabbed her board, strapped the knife to her thigh, and rolled out through the back. Smoke curled around her like a cloak. One of Creed's men spotted her, raised his revolver. Before he could aim, Caleb shot him clean through the chest. Gunfire erupted. The second man charged the porch. Caleb took a hit to the shoulder but didn't fall, just gritted his teeth and fired again. Missed. Rechambered. That's when Nalia struck. Rolling from behind the water trough, she flung her blade. It caught the man in the thigh. He screamed, dropped his weapon. She was already moving, grabbing his rifle as he stumbled. Creed turned toward her, eyes wide. Blood smeared across her cheek, fire lighting her face like war paint. She stood her ground, rifle aimed, chest rising hard. "Try me," she said. Creed paused, looked at Caleb, bleeding but still standing. Looked at her, Apache, broken, burning, and for the first time didn't see a victim. He saw death waiting to be earned. He spit, turned his horse. "You're both already ghosts." And then he was gone. The barn burned down to bones. The air reeked of ash and gunpowder. Blood stained the porch. But they stood. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, panting. Nalia rolled up beside him, hand on his uninjured arm. "You still with me?" she asked. He chuckled, winced, "Till the damn wheels fall off." And just like that, the battle ended. Not in glory, not in triumph, but in survival, side by side. How are you feeling witnessing this scene? Let us know your emotions in the comments below. The barn still smoldered, smoke curling upward like the last breath of an old ghost refusing to let go. The wind had shifted sometime during the night, now blowing eastward, carrying away the scent of gunpowder and blood. Caleb stood knee-deep in the ruins, boots blackened with soot, shirt stuck to his shoulder wound. His good hand clutched the burned wooden cross, his wife's, his daughter's, his past. It had once hung above their bed, survived fire, only to be carried in his pocket for years, like a wound he refused to let scab over. He didn't pray, didn't say a word when he dug into the ash with a rusted tin cup. The hole wasn't deep. It didn't need to be. Some goodbyes don't go to the ground, they go to the heart. He placed the cross inside gently, almost reverently. A tremor passed through him, but he didn't break. He just stared at it for a long moment, lips barely parting. "She's free now," he said. "Not to the sky, not to the ghosts, just to the silence." A shadow wheeled behind him. Nalia. She didn't speak at first, just watched, hands resting in her lap, the wheels of her board locked in place behind the charred doorway. Then she rolled forward. She held out a bone bead, carved long ago by her brother when they were children. He used to wear it for luck. She'd carried it since the day they took him, the day everything fractured. She dropped it beside the cross. And so am I. No thunder cracked, no choir rose. Just wind, just ash, just the scent of cedar and burned earth. Together they stood, or in her case, sat, over the grave of their wounds. Not to forget, but to release. Because forgiveness wasn't about saying it didn't matter. It was saying it mattered, but it no longer controlled them. Caleb brushed ash off her shoulder. She touched his bandaged arm. That was it. The past was not erased, but it was buried, and something lighter took root in its place. A week passed, then two. The ashes settled, the smoke thinned, and the sky returned to its usual dusty blue. No more riders came down the trail. No more threats whispered through the cottonwoods.
Just the wind, then the work, and the kind of silence that didn't feel so hollow anymore. They rebuilt, not fast, not clean, but honest. The barn, now just a frame of scorched beams, remained as it was, a black skeleton against the sky. But the porch? That they fixed first. Caleb sawed old timber with one good arm, jaw clenched, sweat painting dirt down his temples. Nalia, balanced on her board, handed him nails, smoothed splinters with sand-stained cloth. One evening, he added a second chair to the porch, didn't mention it, just placed it next to his, angled slightly toward the sunset. The next night, she sat there, didn't mention it either. Above the door, they hung the sash, still, stitched in black. No longer worn like armor. Now it waved like a flag, catching the breeze. It didn't declare victory. It simply declared, we're still here. Neighbors from Copper Ridge started showing up in ones and twos. A boy brought cornbread, eyes wide but respectful. A rancher stopped by with a crate of nails and didn't ask a single question. Even old Miss Laramie came, her bonnet askew, holding a jar of peach preserves and muttering, "Ain't none of my business what goes on out here, long as it's quiet." No one spoke of creed, or the blood, or the fire. They just nodded, looked around, and let their eyes linger on the second chair. One morning, Caleb caught himself humming. Just a low, broken tune, half forgotten, but his boots tapped a rhythm as he swept the porch. Inside, Nalia rearranged the shelves. She didn't ask if she could. He didn't ask why. It was their place now. Not built on romance, not yet, but on respect, resilience, and a quiet kind of reverence only two scarred souls could understand. The past hadn't vanished, but the present was theirs, and it was enough. Late one afternoon, as shadows began stretching long over the hills, Nalia rolled herself to the fence line, a small cloth sack nestled in her lap. Caleb followed, slow and stiff from the bullet wound, but steady. She opened the bag. Inside were desert seeds, mesquite, wildflower, prickly pear. Hardy things. Things that didn't ask for much, but bloomed when others failed. "I been saving these," she said, voice soft. "Not sure for what." He didn't answer, just knelt down beside her and began to dig with his bare hands. The soil was dry, but it gave way easy. They worked in rhythm, not talking, just moving dirt, dropping seeds, covering them again. A breeze kicked up, sent sand spinning into their faces. Nalia laughed, brushing grit from her cheeks. Caleb chuckled too, low and rusty, but real. Then she reached into her shirt and pulled out a strip of blue cloth, faded, torn, stained. He recognized it, part of the soldier's uniform, the one who left her bleeding in the desert. "Could burn it," she said, "or bury it." She looked up at him, eyes calm. "But maybe it's time we turned it into something worth keeping." She tied the cloth around a thin branch stuck in the earth, like a flag, but smaller, less about conquering, more about surviving. The wind tugged it gently, making it flutter like the last page of an old story. Caleb watched it dance, then turned to her. "I ain't alone no more," he said. She looked back. "Neither are you." They sat there a while, dirt under their nails, the world quiet around them. And somewhere beneath them, unseen but certain, a seed began to split. Out there, on some stretch of forgotten land, under the weight of ash and memory, two souls planted something that would outlast pain. Maybe it was love. maybe just the courage to begin again. But if you've ever stood at the edge of something broken, if you've ever held a memory too tight, or carried silence longer than you should, then maybe, just maybe, this story is yours too. Because even in the driest soil, hope waits, quiet, patient, and strong. Don't forget to share this with someone who might be planting their own beginning. One seed, one porch, one sunrise at a time. If you like this video, comment number 1. If you don't, comment number 2. Please subscribe to the channel to watch more videos and give me more motivation to collect and share other stories.